Today is Monday, May 4th, 2020, which means it's Garaaga. Monday? Hello, Fiendlings, how the hell are you? It's May the 4th, but I'm not celebrating anything Star Wars related. If you want to know why, you can always look up my Star Wars from a hater's perspective essay on the site. I'm sure it will, stir some feelings. Regardless, the original Star Wars was one of the first sci-fi movies I remember seeing, at the ripe old age of 7, and it has obviously stayed in the cultural consciousness for a long time already, and probably will be a relatively permanent fixture for another 50 years. So that is a big deal, and I'm not going to denigrate the achievement. I just know that hands shot first, fuck George Lucas for being a waffling moron, and they keep telling the same fucking trilogy over and over again without any real changes or even thought-provoking drama. Whew. Man, I almost went hater there for a second. Be that as it may, for all you Star Wars fans out there, I hope you enjoy your day. Tomorrow is May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, a much more important day for those of us who are constantly trying to end up with cirrhosis, or that like Mexican food. Much better day in my opinion. Now, this episode is late. I know. I'm doing my best to clear the decks, and every time I do, some new catastrophe is waiting in the wings. So today, I have eschewed all other tasks apart from getting all that shit done. There's a lot of it, trust me. I've talked enough about nothing, don't you think? I hope you enjoyed The Last Hunter, and I hope you enjoy Keepers as well. That said, let's take a listen. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 3 of Legends of Garaaga. Book 2, Keepers, 2200 BCE. The house was dark. Easton awoke shivering on a pallet of cloth. Making his way through the forest to Lothal had left him exhausted. The ocean journey to Akkad had depleted whatever strength had remained. He knew it was only a matter of time before his body rendered him to the gods. Outside, he heard the city awaken. Murmurs of the river were blotted out by the sounds of men making their way to the docks, the crackling of fires, and of women chattering to one another as they headed out for the morning wash. Through a wood-covered window, beams of sunlight spread through the cracks, illuminating the far wall in streaks of dim yellow. Easton coughed, tasted blood, and swallowed. He listened to the rattling in his chest, winced, and let out a soft groan. Now for the first time, the thought he wouldn't live long enough to meet Triani crossed his mind. "For Hanar," he whispered. Hanar had visited him in dark dreams. Her beautiful face twisted and morphed into the wreck he'd seen before fleeing the smoking remains of the village. Her blackened visage tried to speak in the fugue, but said nothing, its lipless mouth merely squirming. If not for the ritual, he would doubtless have joined her in death. Easton opened his palm and stared down at the scar marring his skin. The rough outline of an open eye stared back at him. Ramal had said it was to remind him of his responsibility, as if he'd needed it. The last of the keepers had secreted him away in the Cave of Dreams. Ramal was nearing his own passing, and as was the custom, he chose the youngest man in the village as his successor. Although the rest of the village knew Ramal was the keeper, no one knew what it meant. They only knew that when a keeper chose a successor, the two men would disappear into the forest. The younger of the two was the only one to return. The two men traveled through the forest until nightfall. The path was worn enough for them to follow, but not without some discomfort. Both he and Ramal had scratches across their bare legs and chests from the thick brambles and vines. His wounds itched as they made their way, but he ignored them. Ramal had said nothing since they entered the forest. Easton somehow knew he wasn't supposed to speak unless asked a question. He dutifully followed the older man, unbothered by his slow pace. Easton was in no hurry to reach their destination. The old man would not return to the village. The idea terrified Easton. What if this time neither returned? Their feet crunched over petrified bone as they reached a clearing next to a cave. "Nothing grows here," the old man said in a hushed tone. He turned to face Easton.
More seasons have passed than you can imagine, my son, but nothing will ever grow here.
The old man turned and walked to the cave mouth. Easton stared into the dark hole. There was no light within.
Don't be afraid,
the old man said without turning around. With slow, shuddering steps, Ramal walked into the darkness. Easton took a deep breath and followed. Once inside, the sounds of the forest, the chirping insects, and the calls of monkeys and birds were silenced. All he could hear was the dripping of water and the shuffling of the old man in front of him. His bare feet crunched on ancient dust and gravel. Something snapped beneath his heel. Although he couldn't see it, he knew it was an old bone. The sounds of Ramal's feet on the stone floor changed. Instead of the dull slap and crunch, it became rich. Echoes bounced off some high ceiling. He wanted to ask Ramal where they were, but kept quiet.
Stop.
Easton jumped at the sound of Ramal's haggard, wheezing voice. He stood still, the old man's breath and the dripping water the only sounds. There was nothing to see but blackness. He heard Ramal fidgeting with something.
There will be light,
the keeper whispered.
There will.
Stone ground against stone. Green light erupted from an urn atop a broken and cracked altar. Easton held a hand in front of his eyes, shading them against the glare. The afterimage burned on his retinas, leaving a black spot in the center of his vision.
Do you know what this is, Easton?
The old man asked. Easton followed Ramal's gnarled finger pointing toward the urn. Easton nodded. His eyes had finally adjusted enough to see. Light moss. The old man nodded.
It has been here for forever. It never fades. It never grows. It never dies.
Easton's brow furrowed. Why? The old man smiled in the garish light, his face turning sinister.
Because nothing here dies or lives.
Ramal pointed upwards.
What do you see?
Sharp stone cones stared down from the cavern ceiling. Water dripped from them onto their twins affixed to the floor. Stone. Ramal chuckled.
That's all?
Teeth.
Yes, this place bites. Defends itself against those who would invade.
But it's just a cave. Ramal shook his head.
No, Easton, it's not just a cave.
The old man walked behind the altar.
Come here, young man.
Easton stepped gingerly around broken stone fragments. The floor at the old man's feet glowed the color of the setting sun. Easton let out a hiss between his teeth.
Not just a cave,
the old man said.
A memory is trapped here.
Ramal gestured toward the floor.
Sit, Easton.
The younger man did as he was told. Shards of broken stone pressed into the flesh of his bare legs. Ramal had lowered himself to the floor with a fluid grace. Despite his age, the man's legs easily bent so that the soles of his feet met and pressed together. Back straight, he stared at Easton.
Tell me about Rashim.
Easton blinked. Rashim? Ramal nodded. Just a legend. Ramal smiled and leaned forward.
Then tell me the legend.
Why do you...
Just tell me,
the old man hissed. Rashim was a warrior who bested a monster. Ramal's expression flattened.
That is all you remember?
Easton shrugged.
Do you know what this place is?
No.
Rashim's monster used to live here. This was its lair. The ancient bones outside are those of its victims.
Easton shook his head. The old man was crazy, yet he shivered just the same. Keeper, he whispered. It's only a legend.
I thought the same.
Ramal used his knuckles to drag himself forward until his knees touched Easton's. The younger man fought the urge to pull backward. The keepers were to be shown the greatest respect, or so he'd been taught. But Ramal, last of them all, was obviously insane.
This place, the old man croaked, is a memory. I told you that. It remembers. Ramal put forth his hands. It remembers. So shall we too. Easton stared down at the withered palms. He knew what he was supposed to do, but the idea was distasteful. He felt a surge of frantic energy in his chest. With trepidation, he put his hands in Ramal's. The old man smiled. Once seen cannot be unseen. What? The world exploded into light. Images flashed through Eason's mind. A small man standing in the center of the cave transformed into a gray, gnarled thing. Its claws dripped with blood. Its face curled into an expression of malevolence. Its voice, deep and grating, echoed in his mind.
Do you see, Hunter, how they worship for Garaaga?
A group of naked men and women writhed on the floor around it, moaning in ecstasy, copulating. Man servicing woman, servicing man, women servicing one another and themselves. Crimson waves rose from the orgy and circled the thing in the center of the cave.
Worship,
the thing growled. The group's flesh dissolved, leaving their skeletons frozen in their acts. A ruby-tipped spear blotted out the vision. It flew through his mind, burning bright as it traveled. The face of a brown man, a closed third eye in the middle of his forehead. As the man's dark eyes closed, the third opened, shining with a brilliant blue. A terrible scream ripped through Eason's mind. It was the thing, howling in pain. The vision swirled before him. The creature in the center of the cave held its hands against its head, its jagged, toothed maw frozen in a mask of pain. It detonated into dust and splinters of bone. The dust swirled and then coalesced into a naked, deformed woman squatting in a forest. Her face was covered in bruises. One eye was lower than the other and spun wildly in its socket. Breasts full and drooping, nipples hard, she was mumbling in strange sounds. She raised her head to the sky and screamed. Red and yellow fluid gushed as a bundle of flesh dropped from between her legs to the forest floor. A new scream rose to match hers, but higher in pitch. The newborn thing's crimson eyes opened. Enough! Ramal's voice yelled. Eason snapped back to reality. The old man had dropped Eason's hands. Ramal's breath was a rapid wheeze. Eason shivered. The front of his loincloth was warm with urine, but the rest of his body was ice cold. What? Eason tried to speak through the pounding of his heart and his own rapid chuffs of air. The old man held up a hand to shush him, his body shaking as he tried to gulp in air. After a moment, Eason was able to breathe normally. You saw, Ramal whispered. Eason nodded. What did you see? I don't want to see it again, Keeper. Eason's voice was small and tremulous. What does it mean? The creature's face filled his vision, its maw stuck open in a ferocious, silent growl. The monster, it was real. Ramal nodded. Rashim defeated it. It took a sacrifice, always a woman, every so many seasons. And Ramal shuddered. It feasted upon her, leaving her old before her time and mad with want. He leaned forward and tapped the center of Eason's forehead. The eye sees but does not open, at least not for us. For Rashim? Yes, for Rashim and his kin, but they are no more. Then who protects us from, he swallowed, from the thing? Ramal smiled. The thing is no more in this place. The cave is but a memory, a warning. There is nothing to be afraid of here. Eason blew out a sigh. Then we are safe. Ramal's smile fell. No, young one, you do not understand. Ramal tapped Eason's knee. That was the creature, but not its maker. Not? No, Ramal said. The old man looked down at the dimly lit floor. There are others, he whispered. You saw the birth.
Do you know what it means?
Easton struggled to keep the image from flooding his mind, and failed. In the fugue, the newborn creature had stared into him, through him. He shivered. It gives birth.
Yes and no,
Ramal said, and leaned forward.
the Maker does not give birth, Eason. Its children do.
A god that makes children?
Yes,
Ramal agreed.
Garaaga makes his children in the wombs of the willing, and his children make their own.
Garoga?
Garaaga.
The old man corrected him. Ramal coughed and spit a wad of blood onto the stone floor. It instantly congealed into dust.
You are a keeper now.
Ramal whispered.
You will take the message and pass it on to another. You will bring them here. You will show them what you've seen. In this place, the memory is strong. It will be waiting for you when the time is right.
But how will I know? The old man coughed again and held a hand to his chest. Pain filled his face, and Ramal clenched his rotten teeth.
You will, my son.
You are ill, Ramal. The old man nodded.
I can rest soon. There is one more task to perform.
Eason sat up and wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his brow. Ramal was surely dead now, either from his illness or at the hands of the others. The animals and insects would have made short work of his corpse. Eason traced the lines embedded in the flesh of his hand. Ramal's last act had been to brand him. Though the pain had been mind-numbing, Ramal had demanded Eason repeat the story, the legend, word for word, as the red-hot knife seared and marked his flesh.
You will remember,
Ramal had said. Eason's tears of pain streaked through the dirt on his face as the old man clutched him to his breast.
You will remember, and when it's time, you will tell another, and pass the task to them.
Eason stood. The light outside was growing. The dark dreams of Hanar, Ramal, the cave, tugged at his mind. His chest exploded in another coughing fit. He doubled over in pain as he tried to breathe. Tears dripping from the corners of his eyes, he shuffled to the clay urn in the corner. He spat a wad of bloody phlegm into it and then stood. Eason! A voice called from behind. Eason turned. Hassani stood outside the room. The stout man tugged at his beard. You are not well, the man said. I have been better, Eason admitted. Did you find him? Hassani smiled. Find him, yes. It was enough to make Eason grin. The merchant knew the local language well enough to converse with other merchants, make deals with the waymasters, and carry on small talk, but his accent and grammar were atrocious. Thank you, Eason said. When can we see him? After midday meal. Hassani pointed to the pallet. Sleep more? Eason shook his head. I can't. I have business to make. Yes, Eason said. Are you well enough to come? He'd only seen Akkad in darkness. The city's walls had seemed to glow and a halo of light rose above them. Even after the sun had fallen away for the night, the city buzzed with the sounds of its populace. As tired and ill as he'd been, Eason had hoped he'd live long enough to see Akkad in the brilliance of day. I am well enough, Eason said. Hassani nodded. It is good. Eat? Yes, Eason said. For the first time in days, he felt as though he might actually be able to keep some food down. I am hungry. Good, come. Eason followed Hassani to the kitchen. A fire crackled in a clay hearth. Sit, guest, Hassani said, and pointed to another pallet on the floor. Thank you, Eason said, and dropped to his knees on the soft stuffed cloth. A woman turned meat over the hearth. She didn't turn to look at him. Hassani said something in his native tongue. Eason watched as the woman looked up from the fire and gazed into Hassani's face. Hassani smiled at her, and she returned it. He gestured to Eason, his words rapid-fire syllables. The woman shrugged away the cloth covering her head and turned to him. Eason felt his breath catch. A beautiful almond face stared at him. Her skin was pale compared to Hassani's, as though she'd spent most of her life in shadow. "My woman," Hassani said. "Nahushta." She bowed and then turned back to the fire. "She is very beautiful," Eason said. Hassani laughed. "Of course she is. All women are." He said something else to Nahushta. The woman chuckled but did not look at him. "We have lamb for morning meal, lamb and bread." Eason's stomach growled at the words. "You grace me." "Inky plagues those who do not share." He'd heard the word before, when the wind was finicky or a storm front faced their boat on the great water. Hassani and the other Akkadians had called out to Inky in their strange language, beating their breasts and then praying. Eason wasn't sure what Inky was, and he was polite enough not to ask. "I've not had lamb in quite some time," Eason said. "It is well then," Hassani said. "How long did it take you to find Triani?" Hassani stiffened. "He is not called Triani." Eason furrowed his brow. "Not Triani? You mean you didn't find him?" "No," Hassani said. "Found him. He calls himself something else. Tupsoro." "What does that mean?" Hassani laughed. "The man who marks." "I do not." "Better you see him for yourself than for me to struggle." It took a moment for Eason to understand what Hassani was trying to say. "You don't have the words to explain." "I don't have words," Hassani agreed. Nahushta pulled the spit from the hearth. She handed one end of the blackened dowel to her husband. Hassani bowed to her and then handed it to Eason. "For health," Hassani said. Eason repeated the words. The meat burned his tongue, but he didn't care. The taste of it was exquisite. His belly quieted as he made short work of the tender meat. Hassani laughed and said something to Nahushta. She giggled and passed another spit to her man. "I have not seen you eat like this," Hassani said. "I think you've been waiting for good food." Eason felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude." "Not rude," Hassani said. "A man should eat, should enjoy. A man is sickly if he does not eat well." The portly merchant handed a new spit to Eason. Eason took it. "Eat your fill," he said. Hassani turned and then produced a clay plate of naan. "I will get you water." The merchant walked from the fire into the far side of the kitchen. Eason pulled the meat from the spit and dropped it onto the flat bread. His mouth filled with saliva even before he touched the bread to his tongue. He groaned in pleasure as he tore into the meal. Nahushta turned from the fire to smile at him. He grinned at her as he chewed. She nodded to him and turned back to the crackling hearth. "After meal, we go to the market." Hassani placed a small jug beside Eason's plate. "Get something for night meal." "I still have plenty of beads," Eason said. "I will pay." Hassani waved a hand. "You paid enough in Lothal. It's my pleasure to pay." Eason bowed his head. Hassani took a spit from his woman and sat upon the floor next to Eason. The older man ripped through his food with reckless abandon. His long beard was streaked with grease. "Let us finish quickly," Hassani said with a full mouth. "There's much to see before day meal."